The question is, do you agree that Scotland should be an independent country?
For me, the principle that we work best when we work together.
Well, they didn't.
Very serious.
The referendum. It seems to me that they're not dealing with the issues.
Hello and welcome to Scottish Independence Podcast episode number 50. Although I say 50, it's not really 50. We've had all the April Fool specials, Christmas, Hogmanay and whatever, so the numbers are all a bit messed up, but there you go. This time I spoke to Brian Nugent, who's involved with Yes Shetland. It's interesting to hear from a place that we don't normally hear so much about. So we had an interesting conversation about some of the things that are going up there and why Shetland might be a bit of a microcosm for larger things going on in Scotland. We'll just go straight to the conversation and I'll have a little word with you at the end. Hi Brian, how's it going?
Fine, thank you.
And,
Just been into Lerwick to collect my son from up Helliar. So
where was he coming from and how long did it take to get there?
it's 10 miles. After the procession, the squads all go round the halls and they finish about 8 in the morning. So it's an all-night session of dancing, and they have this little act that they put on. So it's a huge social event. My boy loves it.
So how long's that tradition been going for now?
The 1880s.
So do you get tourists coming for that sort of thing, or is it very much a local event?
Well, it's very much a local event in that usually it's only locals who are involved, but there's plenty of tourists who come up to watch it. Yeah, it's a huge draw in January when normally there wouldn't be too many people coming to visit Shetland.
Okay, so that brings us on to the sort of Nordic idea of Shetland quite nicely, actually, because I read an interesting article. I'll put a link to it in the show notes, but it was talking about the idea of Shetland as an example, moving more towards the sort of Nordic area, because it talked about in Shetland you've already got more social housing than the rest of the UK. Shetland was building it when the rest of the UK was selling it. Do you think there's an example for Shetland from Shetland for the rest of the UK?
Well, a lot of the house building was to do with oil workers coming in because there was a huge influx of workers in the 1970s. And there's actually a huge inflow of workers now as well. There's so much work up here that they've got, 3 or 4 floating hotels, and they just can't find accommodation for their workers. They're putting in a gas plant, Total are in Sulham. So there's a huge amount of work. So Shetland is booming at this point in time. Going back to your question, Winnie Ewan and used to always refer to Shetland as municipal socialism, that there was the housing, there was that, but there was also grants for different things. One of the things that has stopped, which is unfortunate, is used to give out Christmas bonus, but I think it was the charity authorities decided that this wasn't appropriate. There was some legal thing about it anyway, and it was dropped, which was unfortunate.
So it sounds like the local government's working on kind of different principles up there than they do in the rest of Scotland or the wider UK. Who actually controls the local government?
There's 23 councillors. They're independent, all of them. Some of them obviously are party members of different parties, but they never let you know that, or not publicly anyway. And was it 2 councils ago there was a Liberal Democrat group, but they didn't do a great job, so quite a lot of them got booted out, so they're all back to being independent. But the general thing is that they try to, in a very general sense, look after everybody. The reason, of course, is that they've got that extra bit of money because when Sulham was first thought of, the local council asked for a penny a barrel, and there's enough barrels going through Sulham that all those pennies added up, and they have had in the past lots of money, not unlike the idea in Norway and its Statoil funds. But unfortunately, along the way, some of the spending has been what they call up here the Rolls-Royce solution. So the fund is a bit lower now than it has been. Plus, of course, the economic recession hasn't helped either. So there are cuts going on up here, which kind of goes against what I've just said, but that's because everybody lost sight of sensible economics along the way, because there was this huge fund that they felt they could continually draw from.
But it's interesting that, again, with this idea of Shetland as an example to the rest of the country, that you've got this oil fund, and although there's been some mistakes, has it been helping through the recession with some things won't have worked out so well, but maybe some things working better? Well,
the one thing that most visitors notice when they come up here is the roads are great. When I go home to Coatbridge, the first thing, I know I'm in Coatbridge because the roads are rotten. But in Shetland, the roads are great. There are community centres, village halls all over the place. There are swimming pools. I think we've got 7 or is it 8 dotted about. We've only got 22,000 people in Shetland, although that might be up with all the workers at the moment. But we've got 8 swimming pools, and I don't know, they were closing lots of them in Glasgow. I don't know how many are left. So there's all sorts of things like that. They have schools in most places, but that's one of the things that they're going after at the moment to cut, unfortunately. So lots of good rural schools are getting closed, and all the kids are going into the high school, either in Lerwick or in Bray. And there's quite a large care community looking after the older folk. So many of the things that the money has been spent on have been good. Some of the things that the money has been spent on have been less sensible.
And do you think, in part, this is because, okay, it is definitely an isolated community, but the politicians, you're saying they're all independent, or the local government people. Do you think in some way it helps that they're more, it's kind of people first, party second, in a way that you don't necessarily see in other parts of the country? You know, the people are much closer to their local governors in a place that they might be in somewhere like Glasgow, or you've got the Highlands and Islands region, which is enormous, and there's not really that kind of contact with the people. Do you think that's helped Shetland in a lot of ways?
You certainly meet up with your councillor quite a lot, that's for sure. Because of the size of the place and the small population, you're always going to bump into people. But the problem is, if they make a decision and it's a controversial decision, because the councillors are so handy, the issue becomes that people work on the councillors, and then the councillors go in to ratify a decision, and then they change their mind. So it's quite difficult sometimes to get them to stick with a decision. That's the one thing I would say about there being 23 independent councillors. For all it's, the situation in Glasgow and wherever else, at least once a decision's made, they generally stick with it. Whereas up here, there's a lot of chopping and changing.
So it sounds like things are going, well, better than in other parts of the country where there's the profusion of food banks and all the rest of it. But
funnily enough, I'm involved with St Margaret's Catholic Church in Lerwick, and through the Salvation Army, there are food banks in Shetland as well. So it's a shame on Shetland, it's a shame on Scotland, and it's a shame on the UK that people have to survive via food banks. It's just incredible. So the Salvation Army do wonderful work up here. They coordinate the local churches, and the 2 superstores, not superstores, the 2 big shops here. I won't give their names just in case. They do good work as well. They supply food for the food banks too.
in your opinion, how could an independent Scotland benefit Shetland? Because you're obviously part of the Yes Shetland campaign, so it's a given that you support it. Why would Scottish independence be good for Shetland?
Well, there is a small group of people who, on occasion, talk about Shetland going independent. But, as I try to point out to them from time to time, in this referendum at any rate, there's only two options. One is either the UK or it's Scotland. I think that a smaller population, 5 million or thereabouts, and the politicians in Edinburgh, they would be more responsive to the 5 million rather than MPs disappearing down to London, out of sight, out of mind. And it's just a matter of numbers. There's far more people south of the border than there is north of the border. Who are they going to respond to most quickly? They're going to respond to the bigger number of voters. That just doesn't seem arguable to me. It's just common sense.
So it's like Shetland as microcosm, you know. the way that your local politicians are closer to the people, on a slightly larger scale, the same thing with moving it to Scotland instead of London.
Yeah, same sort of idea, yes.
And just to come to that idea about the independence for Shetland specifically, you said there you think it's a small group of people, because, being far away from it, I have to be honest, I'm never quite convinced how real that is, if it's just a few people, if they use it as a stick to beat the Scottish independence movement, or if it is a real sort of movement and phenomenon there.
Well, there are occasional debates on this topic, and it always seems to me that there are certainly people who believe in it quite strongly, to the exclusion of everything else, but I don't think there are as many as there once were. When I first came up here about 20 years ago, if you asked a young guy whether they were Scottish or English or British, they would normally say they were Shetland, and that always confused me. But now I think there's more of the younger people feel that they're Scottish rather, well, they're still Shetland, but they feel something towards Scotland. I don't know if that's the effect of the Scottish Parliament, but I just don't think there's that feeling, certainly amongst the younger folk, and I think possibly the older generations are still, think about themselves as Shetland first, and then they'll think about whether they're Scottish or British or whatever else. I genuinely don't think that there is a real feeling for Shetland independence. When I first came up here, there was a thing called the Shetland movement, and it was in its death throes at that stage. And what they started out with, as I understand it, was they were looking for a lot more local power in Shetland. But for whatever reason, it fell away. They had a candidate in the general election who stood against the Liberal Democrat at the time. The SNP at that time stood down to give them a free run, and John Goodlad, who was the candidate, did as well as, or maybe slightly better than the SNP candidate might have done. So that wasn't huge at that time, 20 years ago, so or even longer. I can't remember what year it was. So I'm not convinced that there's a genuine movement. There's certainly people who are quite vocal and they're good at getting themselves in the paper, but whether there's anything real there or not, I don't know.
Interesting. Okay. And how's the campaign itself going up in Shetland? You think it's more likely to do a yes or a no? I mean, have there been any kind of specific Shetland polls conducted?
There are no Shetland polls that I'm aware of. We've been out with tables. A huge factor here, of course, is the weather. We've been trying to distribute newspapers, but the weather has been so awful for about 2 months that you would have to be absolutely mad to go out and try and leaflet. You come round a corner and you get blown off your feet, it's that bad. So we're praying for some decent weather in the springtime. We have had tables in an enclosed shopping area. The one thing I would say is that there are some very determined yes voters and there are some very determined no voters, and then there's a huge pile of people in the middle who can't make either. They just can't make up their mind. It's the usual thing about they don't have enough information or whatever. What we're planning to do is hold public meetings in all the local areas as much as we possibly can. We've done that in Scalloway. We're about to do it in Borough next month. Obviously, nearer the time, we'll be doing more and more things. I would say at the moment we're probably behind, but then we're behind in Scotland as a whole. But having said that, polls, it seems to me, have started to move. And I think it's just a matter of confidence more than anything else. I think that if the polls get close, then more and more people will come on board. And that's what seems to be happening from the polls at the weekend there.
Yeah, it was looking quite positive. It is looking quite positive at the moment. So just to move on to the last thing, and this is the question I ask everyone, which is what was it for you that made you specifically begin to support independence? For some people, it's a specific moment, a specific story. For some people, it's more of an emotional thing. For some people, it's looking at the figures. I don't know. What is it that convinced you that Scottish independence is the way to go?
I would love to say